The central coast of California has one of the most plentiful marine ecosystems on our planet. It's a living tapestry of biological diversity and home to the adorable Southern Sea Otter. Tourists from around the world flock to see this amazing animal and marvel at its unique behaviors. But after being brought back from the brink of extinction, sea otters are once again in peril. In the last 3 years, an unprecedented number of sea otter mortalities have occurred along the California coast.
California sea otters were already on the endangered species list, and now they're dying off in growing numbers.
Well, an alarming trend off the California coast for the second straight year. Researchers say the state's southern sea otters are dying in very high numbers.
Like crime scene detectives, a team of scientists are anxiously searching for the causes of the mysterious deaths.
One of the lessons to be learned from sea otters is that they're getting hit by a whole bunch of different things, and a lot of that has to do with their unique biology and how they differ from other marine mammals that live along the coast.
But not everyone wants to support a thriving sea otter population. Otters are at the center of a bitter controversy regarding the Fish and Wildlife Service's recent decision to eliminate their no Otter Zone from Southern California waters. For 25 years, this imaginary line in the ocean was designed to protect the interests of the commercial shellfish industry. Many fishermen are outraged by its removal.
It doesn't solve the problem. It continues the problem into a larger area, and into an area that's not as nice as the Central California coast. When you come around Point Conception and you come into an area where there's 20 million people living there, the idea of them coming to the promised land is nonsense.
It would be a basic principle of ecology that if you want more animals, you're going to need more habitat. You can't just cram them all into one spot.
If we get otters in San Diego, it's going to put me out of business. It's just the environmental groups, they have an awful lot of money, they have a lot of political clout, and they're trying to bully their way through this thing.
It's bad. They're bad. They're bad creatures. I think they should stay in Northern California.
Sea otters have also been targets for those who believe environmental conservation is a waste of taxpayer money.
Didn't we talk about the Sea Otter program in California already? Wasn't that one of the things that I said they should cut from their budget in California? Is there a lobbyist for otters and turtles that I don't know about? Because maybe we should hire those lobbyists to, I don't know, represent the people of the United States, and to hell with the otters and the turtles.
Biologists, however, suggest that the plight of sea otters has far-reaching implications that everyone should be concerned about. If otters are struggling, it's an indication of ecological problems that have direct impacts on humans as well.
They are the single finest environmental sentinel for land sea pollution that I've ever seen. We really need to pay close attention to the lessons that sea otters are trying to teach us about what's happening to the environment here in California.
If sea otters were to disappear from our coast, it could be catastrophic to the kelp forest ecosystem and in fact all the nearshore ecosystems up and down California.
For a fragile species threatened by pollution, infectious diseases, starvation, and competition with fishermen, this is a crucial time for the Southern Sea Otter as they struggle for survival. The historic range of sea otters extended from the North Pacific Rim down to Baja California. At one time, the southern sea otter population along the California coast is believed to have sustained close to 16,000 animals. The species remained abundant throughout its range until the mid-1700s, when Russian explorers first arrived in Alaska and started harvesting sea otters for their thick, luxurious pelts. By the late 1700s, the British and Americans had joined in the profitable otter hunt. During this maritime fur trade, 200,000 sea otters were killed. By 1867, the sea otter population was on the brink of extinction. In 1911, the International Fur Treaty was signed, protecting all remaining sea otters from hunting. Yet despite these protections, by 1920, there were no known otters remaining in California waters. For 20 years, southern sea otters were thought to be extinct, until a small raft of 50 otters were spotted in 1938 at Bixby Bridge along the rugged Big Sur coast. Since the fortuitous discovery of the surviving group, scientists have closely monitored the sea otter population in hopes of ensuring its recovery. During the late 1960s, increased media exposure brought the plight of the sea otters to a national audience.
With the improved ability to capture them alive and unharmed for relocation or study, conclusions about them can more swiftly and surely be reached, so that these animals may never again face the threat of extinction.
Since their discovery at Bixby Bridge, the California sea otter population has increased at a slow but steady pace. By 1975, the population supported an estimated 1,600 animals across the central California coast. Yet in 1977, southern sea otters were listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. The concern was that a massive oil spill could eliminate the entire otter population in California.
Sea otters are particularly troubled by oil spills. Whenever we have a massive oil spill, the oil accumulates on the surface where otters like to rest as they groom. And the problem is that otters are covered by very dense fur that is their primary source of insulation. So if oil covers that fur, then they lose their insulating ability. The fur no longer insulates correctly, similar to the way that you might wear a wet sweater isn't going to keep you warm, and therefore the otters actually freeze to death. Because otters are so threatened by any type of oil spill, and because oil spills can be catastrophic in nature, there was an experimental translocation in 1987 by the Fish and Wildlife Service, where they took some of the otters from the central coast of California and moved them to San Nicolas Island, farther away, in hopes that there would be at least a remnant colony there that would establish itself and survive should an oil spill wipe out the majority of the otters along the rest of the California coastline.
Unexpectedly, however, the experimental translocation program required special legislation from Congress, and that law had strings attached.
When the Fish and Wildlife Service was starting to put together plans to translocate sea otters to another location, and we were considering a few locations, including San Nicolas Island, it was pointed out to us that the Marine Mammal Protection Act didn't allow for the creation of experimental populations. So we had to go to Congress for a special law, and that law was Public Law 99625. Now, when you go to Congress, you often come back with something that has more elements than you originally anticipated, and that was the case with this law.
Under intense pressure from the commercial shellfish industry, which feared otters in Southern California waters would decimate their harvest, a no Otter Zone was created in 1987. Any otters found swimming south of Point Conception were required to be captured by the Fish and Wildlife Service and moved out of the management zone.
The no Otter Zone is an imaginary line in the sea at Point Conception, which is generally regarded as the point dividing Southern California from Northern California. And once otters cross that line, they lose the full protections of the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act.
From August 1987 to July 1990, 140 sea otters were captured between Monterey and Morro Bay and then released at the remote military island of San Nicolas. Yet by March of 1991, just 13 remained. Many of the relocated otters swam back to their original habitat north of Point Conception. Some died as a direct result of the translocation process, while an astounding 50% were never accounted for and presumed dead.
The impetus behind the translocation program was to move a number of animals to San Nicolas Island, and it was to benefit the population by having a protected population out at San Nicolas Island, and instead it actually did the reverse.
The few remaining otters at San Nicolas were prohibited from straying from the island into the no otter zone. By law, any such otters that moved into the no otter zone were required to be relocated back to San Nicolas Island or their parent range. Unfortunately, this relocation proved deadly.
In 1993, 2 sea otters that we had recently removed from the management zone were found dead within 2 weeks of removal. And we decided that we really needed to take a hard look at removals from the management zone, look at our methods, and look at the effects of that. So we did stop removing sea otters in '93, and no sea otters really entered the zone until 1999, so it wasn't really an issue. In 1999, large numbers of sea otters started moving seasonally into the zone, and fishermen called upon us to move sea otters, and we said, wait, we're going to issue a notice of policy saying that we're not going to remove any sea otters until we've reevaluated the entire program.
Shell fisheries and sea otters cannot coexist in the same place. The shell fisheries harvest these things, and they harvest sustainably. A sea otter doesn't know sustainable harvesting. They eat and deplete the resource until it's gone down.
We expect that some of the shellfish industries will be unable to maintain themselves in the presence of sea otters. So namely, that would be the sea urchin commercial fishery. We think that sea otters would outcompete those fishermen, and those fishermen would be driven further south or to other areas where sea otters don't occur if they wanted to keep fishing.
10 years passed with no action from the Fish and Wildlife Service, so a lawsuit was filed in 2009 by 2 environmental groups, forcing the service to make a formal decision about the translocation program and the no otter zone.
We brought the lawsuit because it was clear that there was outside pressure needed to overcome the political opposition that the service had been facing in finalizing this failure determination and declare an end to a program that has been recognized as broken for nearly 2 decades. The Fish and Wildlife Service tried to dismiss the lawsuit, and the judge in our case denied that and said, in denying their motion to dismiss, said, you clearly have a legal duty here, and you made a commitment to the public in this original 1987 rule to make a decision whether or not the program had failed, and they had never fulfilled that promise.
After 18 months of review and public testimony, in December of 2012, the Fish and Wildlife Service finally declared the translocation program a failure and officially removed the no otter zone. Sea otters are now permitted to migrate into Southern California waters. Many fishermen are angered by the decision and feel the emphasis should instead focus on improving the otter's habitat along the Central Coast.
So why would you say that's a failure and not say that the range is the failure? That's where the failure exists. Now, if you're going to call something a failure, the existing program in the range where they're dying and where there's pollution is the problem. So get on with the problem. Stop talking about this zone and this translocation. Get to the crux of the problem. Buy in the people who are involved in it and solve the damn problem. You know, tired of listening to people saying fishermen are a problem.
If we get otters in San Diego, it's gonna put me out of business because there won't be any sea urchins for the divers to harvest because the otters will take everything. All these workers here won't have jobs. So, I don't care about me personally as much as the company and, the sushi bars that rely on the product and the employees that rely on the work. It won't be here anymore.
Most scientists and fishermen agree that allowing sea otters to expand into Southern California waters will have negative effects on the commercial sea urchin industry. The economic impact of this, however, may be lessened by an increase in tourism in the region.
Dr. John Loomis did a study through Defenders of Wildlife to look at the economic benefits, and what the study found were significant benefits of having sea otters return to the area that would greatly benefit the communities of Santa Barbara and Ventura counties, which would clearly outweigh the benefits brought from a small segment of the fishing industry. The environmental community has been involved with the fishing industry from the very beginning of these discussions on the No Otter Zone. I think in the future we would be open to engaging with the fishing industry on something that could help their industry, because we don't just care about the sea otter, we care about the health of the whole ecosystem. By trying to recover the sea otter, are also trying to recover other species, fish, invertebrates. So we care about these other animals because what sea otters do is bring back the health and the numbers of those animals.
Scientists are well aware of the crucial role sea otters play in maintaining the health of the nearshore ecosystem. This is the prominent reason why environmentalists are advocating for their return to Southern California waters.
Sea otters are a classic keystone species, and what we mean by this is we take a look at one species that when they're present in an ecosystem, the diversity index goes way up. And that means there's a lot more different plants, animals, or other types of organisms. We definitely see that with the sea otters.
The kelp itself is really important in providing food and habitat. It grows from the bottom all the way up to the surface, and it can do that pretty quickly, so it's a really productive plant. And the animals that eat the kelps are animals like sea urchins and abalones. Then there's also food that comes in from outside the kelp forest in terms of particulate food, and fish swimming in, that have fed out elsewhere. So it's a pretty complicated food web.
Where kelp is abundant, a complex and vibrant ecosystem emerges, filled with diverse fish and invertebrates that use the protective canopy as habitat. When sea otters are absent from this ecosystem, sea urchins frequently overgraze the kelp forest, destroying this critical marine environment.
If you remove those sea otters or we lose them, those sea urchins would just be able to populate unchecked. They would consume and mow down all of the kelp in the area. Essentially, the coast as we know it would be changed for the worse.
The thing that's of real interest with the sea urchin fishery is the effect it's had. So the sea urchin fishermen claim that it's been positive for the kelp forest, and maybe it has, but I haven't seen any evidence that would really overcome the scientific burden of proof standard that would show that that's really happened. But I do know they only fish the red sea urchin, and it's the purple sea urchin that also overgrazes and dominates many areas in Southern California.
What we see in Southern California is the consequence of the absence of sea otters. It's not impoverished, but on the other hand, it doesn't really resemble what it did when sea otters were there functioning as a top predator in the ecosystem. So as sea otters expand their range into Southern California, we will expect to see an increased abundance of kelp in areas where sea urchins are limiting kelp.
Allowing otters to repopulate Southern California coastal waters may have other benefits as well. A study recently published in the journal Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment suggested that sea otters may help to reduce the effects of climate change.
The higher the number of sea otters, the more abundant the kelp. And when kelp is more abundant, they're able to grow rapidly and draw a lot of CO2 out of the atmosphere. By removing these greenhouse gases, we're actually taking steps to reduce the effects of global warming.
Because of the sea otter's crucial impact on the nearshore environment and their accessibility to researchers, they have been one of the most studied marine mammals on the planet. Over time, the research done by scientists has shown that otters are vulnerable to human influences and how the population has become increasingly threatened.
We count the otters every year. We want to know how many otters there are. And we do field research, so we capture animals and instrument them with radio tags and things and keep track of them over long periods of time to see how they're doing. We take samples from them to see how their health is. We also look at the dead animals, so we've got a network that goes out and picks up as many dead otters as we can find and sends them to the Department of Fish and Game to be looked at and determine why they died. And our program here, we help on both those things, but we're kind of in the middle where we see the animals sort of transitioning from life to death and seeing how some of these diseases work in the animals and which ones are more serious than others.
Well, the research that we've been doing collaboratively with California Department of Fish and Game and Monterey Bay Aquarium, University of California at Santa Cruz, Fish and Wildlife Service, and a variety of other organizations has really opened up the story and made it possible for us to understand a whole variety of ways in which human activities have increased exposure of sea otters and many other species in the marine environment to a variety of natural and unnatural toxins.
Since 2009, sea otters along the central California coast have experienced an alarming increase in mortality.
For the number of otters that are counted every year, which is roughly about 2,700 to 2,800 along the California coast, we're recovering over 10% of those animals dead every year.
For more than a decade now, scientists have been anxiously searching to discover why the species is struggling and what it means for the entire ocean ecosystem.
One of the things that I also have learned from doing these examinations is what incredible environmental sentinels these animals are. They're so good at showing you what's happening in that nearshore marine environment where they live, if you pay attention and you look for some of those subtle signs. Beginning in early 2007, we started getting a number of sea otters presented for postmortem examinations that showed something that I couldn't remember having ever seen before. And what we were seeing in those animals was that the gums, the whites of the eye, instead of being white or pink as it should normally be colored, these areas were bright yellow. Once we examined the abdomen, what we found was that the livers of affected otters were very swollen, and one of the striking findings about this is even if the otter was brought in after it had just died, is when I would go to lift some of these livers out of the abdomen to look at them more closely, they'd literally fall apart in my hands.
Having never seen symptoms like this before, Dr. Miller began to investigate possible causes for these mortalities. The results challenged everything she knew about the marine ecosystem.
I thought at first, geez, I'm crazy for even thinking about this because it doesn't seem to make sense with anything that I was taught in veterinary school. And what I was considering at the time is what we used to call blue-green algae. Now we call these cyanobacteria because when scientists looked at the DNA of these organisms, they realized they're actually bacteria, not algae. And there's a group of those cyanobacteria called Microcystis is the major group, and they produce this range of toxins called microcystins that are very, very toxic to the liver. When I went to look at the literature and to see if anybody else had ever reported this in a marine mammal, there was no reports anywhere.
After lab tests confirmed microcystins were present in the livers of the dead otters, they discovered that Pinto Lake, just a few miles east of Monterey Bay, had some of the highest concentrations of the toxins ever recorded in North America. A thorough examination determined the microscopic killer had flowed from Pinto Lake through a series of waterways into the habitat of the sea otters.
Microcystis thrives in warm, nutrient-rich waters, which happen to be exactly what comes off of our agriculture fields and into our lakes and reservoirs. It can flush out from the freshwater into the marine habitat where, since it's so stable, it can persist there for a while, where it gets bioaccumulated up by shellfish and other filter feeders. So when mammals or other organisms that eat these shellfish, then they can get the microcystin poisoning, which just wreaks havoc on your liver.
We now have 31 otters that have tested positive for this toxin, and we have yet to find any area in the ocean that tests positive except after rainstorm events when there's fresh water flowing from land to sea.
Agricultural runoff and other human-produced pollution are not the only inland threats plaguing sea otters. The discovery of the Toxoplasma gondii parasite in otters has once again challenged conventional scientific wisdom, revealing a surprising connection to a land-based animal.
The work on the parasite Toxoplasma gondii started when ourselves and another group of other scientists were discovering that sea otters were infected with a parasite that normally you'd expect to find in land animals. And the reason that seemed a little bit odd is because the only animals that are known to shed The tough, environmentally resistant egg stage of those parasites are cats. Toxoplasma gondii seems to be associated with cats of any species, shed in their feces, makes their way down to the ocean, and then from there can get into sea otters.
As many as 50% of all cats have been infected by Toxoplasma at some point in their lives. Outdoor cats in particular have a much higher risk of exposure due to their ingestion of disease-carrying hosts such as rodents and birds. While symptoms rarely surface for cats, 17% of sea otters die from the brain disease caused by this deadly parasite. Much like other diseases that plague them, Toxoplasma gondii infects sea otters by accumulating in the foods they eat.
We certainly have found that infection is actually much more common than we realized. To put things in perspective, if you're an adult male sea otter living along the coast of California, your chances of being infected with Toxoplasma are roughly about 70%, so pretty darn high for something that is coming from cats. Essentially, once the animal has it, it's probably infected for life, and in some cases, it can probably go through its whole life and survive the infection and do okay, but you can imagine that if it's an animal that then becomes sick for any other reason or is wounded, that this parasite then can essentially reactivate and reinvade and extend its infection throughout the body. So it's kind of a continuing liability for the sea otters.
The parasites that are ending up in the ocean where they wouldn't normally be in the ocean, and the reason they're ending up in the ocean is because of us, because we are putting them into our waterways or into our storm sewers.
So what happens is, over time, pollutants build up on land surfaces, and then when it rains, that very first heavy rain of the season, that typically has the most pollutant loading in with it, since it's just been accumulating through our long, dry, hot seasons, that when it rains, that all flushes down. So water starts actually flowing out of some of our lakes, and it flows through our river system and straight out to the ocean. Stormwater on the West Coast is completely untreated, and that often is why we have such high pollutant loads. The problem with development is kind of a 1-2 punch. Development is not only contributing to urban pollution, but you're also developing over the mechanisms that are naturally in place to clean up that problem. So since the mid-1800s, California has lost 90% of our wetlands. A lot of that being coastal estuaries and lagoons. One of the problems with wetlands is a lot of them tend to exist where people want to also. Coastal wetlands turns out kind of a great place to live, and so a lot of that gets filled in, paved over.
We take wetlands and we tend to get rid of them and instead convert the nearshore processes to culverts and pipes and concrete ditches and those kinds of things. We take away things like wetlands that actually act as natural buffers or natural kidneys for pollution.
Sea otters are particularly susceptible to a variety of toxins and parasitic infections due to the diversity of prey items in their diet. They must now spend much of their time foraging for food that is becoming increasingly scarce along the central California coast. Many otters there have become malnourished. As another consequence of their unique biology, survival requires them to turn to less nutritious, more toxic prey, forcing them to expend precious energy searching for additional food.
Sea otters, in comparison to many other marine mammals, don't have the thick blubber layer that helps keep them warm. Therefore, they lose a lot of their heat to the water. As a consequence, they have to eat a lot more food, a higher percentage of their body weight per day, in order to get the fuel they need to burn through it and generate that heat that they keep losing. They can eat as much as 25 to 30% of their body weight per day. As a human, this would be like if you were a 160-pound human, you eat 60 pounds of hamburgers per day just to maintain the right amount of heat.
Typically, sea otters rest a lot of the time. They spend more than 50% of their time resting and conserving the energy for whenever they're going to try to go down and dive for their food resource. They spend about 17 to 38% of their time, depending on age and diving ability, diving for their actual food resource.
When a sea otter forages, they have a choice among many dietary items, assuming that they're all available. The best ones are going to be the ones that have the highest caloric values, such as sea urchins and abalone. But if those aren't available, or they're in low numbers, sea otters might actually start changing what they prey on. And this may include lower caloric value items such as turban snails and sand crabs, and therefore, because they need more of these food items to fulfill their daily requirement, they have to actually forage for longer.
Our research suggests the proportion of time spent feeding by individual animals has increased to the maximum possible amount, which is about 45 to 50% of their daily activity budget spent feeding.
As many sea otters are resorting to eating less nutritious prey, their overall health is adversely affected.
Monterey Bay has a great abundance of invertebrates, but it also has a great abundance of sea otters. And so there is increasing competition for those food resources among the many sea otters that exist there. Tim Tinker has suggested that sea otters in the Central California range do have poorer body condition than in areas where sea otters are not food limited at all, such as at San Nicolas Island.
And we believe in the areas of densest population abundance in Central California that the population is approaching or is at the effective carrying capacity of those regions based on the availability of resources.
The carrying capacity is the maximum number of individuals that the environment will support with the given resources. Types of resources include land, food, or space. So for sea otters, the major driving factors of carrying capacity appear to be food. So if that's the case, then to expand the environment's carrying capacity, we either need to add more food to that particular region or possibly expand the landscape and go elsewhere.
Will range expansion allow for a higher carrying capacity for the population as a whole? The answer is really simple, yes. Yeah, there's no doubt about that. It's a density type equation. So the more habitat you have available for a population, the higher the sustainable population size. That's a pretty simple relationship.
Southern range expansion would be absolutely critical to reaching the optimum sustainable population size, which is something that's mandated under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And that population size would be around 8,000 animals. And there's no way that that could be achieved by limiting sea otters to the Central Coast.
For these reasons, the Fish and Wildlife Service finally decided to officially remove the No Otter Zone. Many environmentalists, however, fear that the struggle is far from over.
In the environmental community, we're pretty confident that the next step is that the fishing industry will file a lawsuit and that the environmental community needs to be prepared to intervene.
Yet not all fishermen are concerned about sea otters entering Southern California waters.
Basically what I'm doing, I work up right next to the otters. I see them all the time, and I haven't felt they've really affected my business at all. So I don't see much of an impact.
I don't really see it being an issue at all. I mean, sea otters have been around here for, thousands and thousands of years, and there's still lobster, there's still crab. I mean, nothing's gone extinct because of sea otters, so far as I know. I mean, I've never heard of anything. They're just little furry creatures that just want to live. Who cares?
I think we can adapt, and I feel there might be some guys that'll drop out, but there's always new guys getting in, it seems like.
Scientists believe that fishermen will have plenty of time to adapt to the gradual southern migration of sea otters.
Now, the best model of range expansion that we have available was done by Tim Tinker and others, and that suggests that sea otter range will be at either Carpinteria or Oxnard within about 10 years. Range expansion occurs at just a few kilometers a year, and sometimes there are retractions of the range. And so it's a somewhat slow and methodical process.
Fishermen and environmentalists don't often agree, but one of the things that there's universal agreement is the problem of water pollution on marine populations. Tackling the marine pollution problem, that just makes everyone happy. You get healthier fish. You have people who depend on fish for either food or to make a living. They're able to do better.
Because we share a lot of the same foods, it's very important that we pay attention to the lessons that the sea otters are trying to tell us and make sure that where possible we maintain a clean food supply, not only for the continued survival of sea otters, but also to optimize our own health and well-being.
You have to look and you see what's my impact on clean water. You know, where am I contributing to water pollution, and then take those relatively simple steps to minimize your own impact.
Even though I work on a cat parasite affecting otters, I actually really like cats, but my 3 cats live indoors, and I am very attentive to cleaning the cat box and disposing of the litter in a way that minimizes the chance that the feces would make their way into the ocean.
Constructing wetlands will go a long way to cleaning our waters. One great example of how that could work is in the San Dieguito Lagoon here in San Diego, where they construct a relatively small 4-acre wetland that they force all of the stormwater that would otherwise run untreated in the lagoon through this wetland, and it's been shown to be an amazingly effective job at removing nutrients, removing fecal indicator bacteria, trapping sediment before it can get in the lagoon. These small scale projects are having a tremendous positive benefit to our oceanic and marine pollution problem. So the first step in solving the microcystis problem is you have to know where it is. You have to know the extent of the problem, and currently there is no regional-wide assessment of that. We just simply don't know where the problem areas are, what are the direct causes, and how to clean it up. If the monitoring is showing that the microcystis is thriving in waters that are ag runoff, then the solution would be better management practices on farms to make sure that they retain the water that they're using for their irrigation.
So ultimately, the question is always asked, what can the general public do to help in the recovery for sea otters? And one way is through the tax checkoff in California, where taxpayers can contribute to a sea otter fund that would help sea otter research and conservation.
How much do we, as humans, as a society, value having an intact ecosystem with sea otters? It's partially an ecological question, and partially it's a societal question that we're going to, as a society, are going to have to make that final call.
So my vision for sea otter recovery in the future is that in 20 years, we see a population that has been taken off the endangered species list. We see a sustained growth in the population over consecutive years, and we've addressed a lot of the threats that sea otters are faced with.
The sea otter existed in Southern California for thousands of years. This species was almost driven to extinction. It was thought extinct, so it's a great recovery story. I think anybody who has ever seen an otter, especially in their natural habitat, it's sort of impossible not to, feel a kinship and appreciate how charismatic they are as well. So it's a great success story, and I think just the otter deserves to exist and recover in its own right as well.
Confronting the myriad of threats facing California's sea otters requires a commitment from all of us. As Jacques Cousteau once said, "For most of our history, we've had to fight nature to survive. We are finally beginning to realize that in order to survive, we must protect it. The sea, the great unifier, is our only hope. We are all in the same boat together." The Southern Sea Otter's struggle is but a glimpse into this reality. It is ultimately up to us to decide what we want for our oceans, and if we have the resolve to protect a threatened species that needs our help.